For decades, the world only saw one version of Africa. The version shown on TV screens: starving children, endless wars, corruption, and hopelessness. A continent painted in black and white tragedy, as if that was all there ever was. And because of this, people outside Africa never imagined anything else could come from here, especially not innovation, technology, or billion-dollar companies. But hidden beneath this silence, something extraordinary has been growing. A quiet revolution, led not by foreign aid, but by Africans themselves. And at the heart of this transformation is one man who refuses to accept the old narrative: Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He doesn't just see Africa as a land of minerals and cheap labor like the West always has. He sees it as a land of thinkers, builders, creators, the future Silicon Valley of the world. While others laughed at the idea of African tech unicorns, Traore dared to imagine them. And that imagination is now rewriting history. This isn't just the story of apps or startups. It's the story of Africa breaking free from chains of dependency and quietly, almost silently, becoming a force that no one can ignore. But here's the question: how does a young soldier, barely in his 30s, become the spark for Africa's technological awakening? The answer lies in vision. While most leaders cling to old models of power, guns, politics, and handshakes with foreign powers, Ibrahim Traoré looked somewhere else. He looked at the youth. In Burkina Faso, over 70% of the population is under the age of 25. For years, these young people were told their future was outside, risking their lives to cross deserts and oceans for the hope of work in Europe. But Traoré flipped the script. He told them, "Your future is not in Paris or New York. It is here in Ouagadougou, in the soil you were born from, in the ideas you carry in your mind." So instead of just building military power, Traoré started investing in knowledge power: coding schools, innovation hubs, partnerships with African universities. Suddenly, young people who once felt forgotten began to see a new path. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were creating, and the world didn't see it coming. Because revolutions are usually loud. But this one was silent, built line by line, code by code, in dimly lit rooms where young Africans were crafting apps, platforms, and solutions that could rival Silicon Valley itself. It started small: a few laptops in a dusty room, a handful of students, some who had never touched advanced software before, staring at glowing screens with determination in their eyes. On the surface, it didn't look like much. But in reality, it was the birth of something historic. Traoré believed that technology wasn't just about apps or gadgets. It was about sovereignty. For decades, Africa had been forced to import everything: food, fuel, even basic software. Nations paid billions to foreign companies for systems that could have been built at home. To Traoré, that was another kind of colonization, a digital one. So he declared, "If we can grow our own food, we can also grow our own technology." And that simple statement turned into a movement. Young innovators began designing payment platforms tailored for Africa's unbanked millions. Others worked on apps that connected farmers directly to buyers, cutting out exploitative middlemen. Even in healthcare, new software was created to track medicines and fight counterfeit drugs. These weren't just startups. They were lifelines. And for the first time, global investors, who once ignored Africa as too risky, began to whisper. They saw potential. They saw billion-dollar ideas taking shape in places they had never bothered to look before. And all of this from a nation the world once dismissed as one of the poorest. Burkina Faso, under Traoré's vision, was proving that innovation didn't need skyscrapers or Silicon Valley campuses. It needed belief, courage, and a leader who dared to say, "We will not be left behind." But success never comes without resistance. The moment Africa's silent tech rise began to show its teeth, the world powers started paying attention. Western corporations, long used to treating Africa as nothing more than a resource mine, suddenly saw something they had never expected: competition. Real, homegrown competition. Big investors from Europe and America tried to buy into these startups, offering huge amounts of money to take control. Some African founders were tempted. Who wouldn't be when you've grown up in poverty and suddenly someone waves millions in your face? But Ibrahim Traoré pushed a different message. Don't sell your future for pocket change. Build it, own it, protect it. And this wasn't just talk. He introduced policies that gave tax breaks to local startups, protected intellectual property from being stolen, and even set up a sovereign African investment fund to help new companies grow without depending on outsiders. It was bold, it was dangerous, and it was unheard of in Africa's modern history. Of course, not everyone was happy. International banks began pulling out. Foreign governments issued warnings. Media headlines painted Traore as a reckless nationalist. But on the ground, something powerful was happening. Young Africans were beginning to believe they could create billion-dollar companies without selling their souls to Silicon Valley. And this belief, that Africa could stand on its own feet in technology, was more revolutionary than any protest, any gun, or any speech at the United Nations. The first real breakthrough came quietly, almost like a whisper, yet it shook the entire continent. In Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital, a small team of young developers launched a mobile payment platform. At first, no one believed in them. They were mocked by bankers, ignored by foreign investors, and even laughed at by rival companies. But Traore didn't laugh. He saw in them what nobody else did: resilience. He personally visited their office, a tiny room with broken chairs and second-hand laptops. And instead of speeches, he asked them one simple question: what do you need to win? Within months, the government provided infrastructure support, faster internet lines, legal protections, and access to rural markets. That little startup exploded, spreading across villages where people had never even seen a bank before. Suddenly, farmers were selling their crops with a click, mothers were saving money securely for the first time, and young entrepreneurs were reinvesting profits right back into their communities. And then it happened. Investors began to notice. Not because the company begged for recognition, but because its growth was undeniable. Within 3 years, that small startup became Africa's newest unicorn, valued at over $1 billion. But here's the twist. Unlike so many African success stories of the past, this one wasn't swallowed by foreign buyers. It remained proudly African, owned and run by the very people who built it from nothing. And every young African watching suddenly asked themselves, if they can do it, why can't we? What followed was nothing short of a chain reaction. The success of that first unicorn lit a fire in the hearts of millions. Across Africa, young men and women began to believe that technology wasn't just something imported from Silicon Valley or Shanghai. It could be born right here, from their own hands. In Dakar, students crowded into internet cafes, teaching themselves coding from free online courses. In Nairobi, university dropouts built drones to deliver medicine to remote villages. In Lagos, young women created apps that helped farmers predict weather patterns and increase their harvests. Suddenly, tech was no longer a distant dream. It was a revolution happening on dusty streets, in crowded classrooms, and in tiny garages. And everywhere this movement spread, one name kept coming up: Ibrahim Traoré. His leadership had become a symbol, not just for Burkina Faso, but for an entire continent. He was no longer just a president or an army captain. He was the man who told Africans to believe in themselves when the world told them they couldn't. Of course, the foreign press didn't like it. They called it dangerous populism, economic suicide, even tech nationalism. But for the young dreamers building apps and startups, Traore was proof that leadership could create possibilities bigger than borders. It wasn't just about technology anymore. It was about identity, dignity, and power. Africa wasn't waiting for handouts. It was finally creating its own future. The rise of Africa's tech unicorns didn't go unnoticed. In boardrooms from Paris to Washington, alarms began to ring. Analysts who once dismissed Africa as too unstable or too risky were now warning their governments. If this continues, Africa won't just be a market, it will be a competitor. Suddenly, the same foreign powers that had stripped Africa of its resources for centuries were now worried about something new: African intelligence. Not gold, not oil, not diamonds, but brains. And this terrified them more than anything. Tech conferences in Europe started hosting urgent panels on Africa's digital boom. Secret memos circulated about how to contain the momentum. Investment groups tried to buy out African startups before they grew too powerful, offering millions in quick cash to founders who had once lived on pennies. But there was a problem. These new entrepreneurs weren't so easily fooled. They remembered Traore's words: Africa must own what it creates. And with that conviction, deal after deal was rejected. Western media tried another tactic. They began to paint African startups as unstable, corrupt, or doomed to fail. Yet each attack only fueled the fire. The narrative was changing. For the first time in modern history, Africa wasn't just defending itself, it was on the offensive. And at the center of it all was a soldier-turned-leader, Ibrahim Traoré, whose vision had transformed Burkina Faso from a forgotten corner of the Sahel into a symbol of global disruption. For the first time, ordinary Africans began to feel the change in their daily lives. This wasn't just about billion-dollar companies. It was about the farmer in Burkina Faso who could now check crop prices on his phone before walking to the market. It was about the young student in Bamako who could attend virtual classes taught by professors halfway across the world, without ever leaving his village. In marketplaces once ruled by chaos, mobile payment systems brought order. Mothers no longer had to travel hours just to pay school fees. They could do it instantly with a few taps. Taxi drivers used apps to find passengers, saving fuel and earning more than ever before. Everywhere, technology began to chip away at old barriers of poverty, distance, and inequality. And people knew this wasn't charity. This wasn't foreign aid. This was Africa helping itself, powered by its own innovation. When people looked at Ibrahim Traoré, they didn't just see a president anymore. They saw a leader who believed that a nation's dignity lies in its ability to build, not beg. And that belief was spreading faster than any investment, faster than any outside influence. For the first time in decades, hope wasn't imported. Hope was homegrown. The ripple effects could no longer be contained within Africa's borders. What began in small hubs like Ouagadougou, Lagos, and Nairobi was now making headlines in New York, London, and Beijing. Global investors were shocked. How had a continent once labeled as dependent suddenly produced tech companies valued in the billions? How was it possible that nations once begging for aid were now setting the pace in fintech, AI, and green technology? But it wasn't just about economics. There was something deeper that unsettled the world's old powers: confidence. For the first time in generations, Africans were not waiting for permission. They were building, they were winning, and they were refusing to sell out. At the center of it all, Ibrahim Traoré stood tall, not as a puppet, not as a proxy, but as a symbol of a new era. In the corridors of Western power, officials whispered his name with unease. They asked themselves a question they never thought possible: what if Africa no longer needs us? And across the global south, from Latin America to Asia, leaders watched closely. If Africa could rise through vision, courage, and unity, then maybe, just maybe, they could too. But as Africa's star rose higher, shadows began to form. Not everyone welcomed this revolution. For every success story, there was an enemy working quietly in the background. Old powers, threatened by Africa's independence, launched their counterattacks. They didn't send armies this time, no. The battlefield was digital, financial, and psychological. Propaganda machines painted African startups as unstable, risky, or unsafe for investors. Western media downplayed their achievements, while foreign lobbyists pressured banks to block funding. Some African leaders, bribed or threatened, tried to sabotage the movement from within. Internet blackouts mysteriously hit cities where tech companies were booming. Promising projects suddenly collapsed under legal issues or security concerns. It was as if someone was pulling invisible strings to slow the momentum. And yet, Ibrahim Traoré did not flinch. In speeches that went viral across the continent, he exposed these tactics, warning Africans. They will try to divide us. They will try to weaken us. But remember, our destiny will not be written in Washington, Paris, or London. It will be written here in Africa. The attacks only fueled the fire. Instead of breaking, people grew more determined. Every act of sabotage became proof that Africa was finally on the right path, because only success attracts this much resistance. And then something remarkable happened. What was meant to divide Africans ended up uniting them. Across cities and villages, young people picked up their phones, their laptops, and their voices. They turned every attempt at sabotage into a rallying cry. Hashtags like #AfricaRising and #ProudlyAfrican began trending, not just in Burkina Faso, but in Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and soon across the globe. Hackathons were organized in internet cafes, under trees, even in candlelit classrooms when power failed. Teenagers who once dreamed of escaping Africa now dreamed of building Africa. They weren't asking for opportunities anymore. They were creating them. In one powerful moment, a group of students in Ouagadougou launched a fintech app just weeks after their internet was cut off. Their story spread like wildfire, becoming a symbol of resilience. If they can build under blackout, people said, imagine what Africa can do with full light. Through all of this, Ibrahim Traoré's words echoed like a drumbeat. Our strength is not in the weapons of others, but in the hands of our youth. They are Africa's true army. For the first time in history, millions of young Africans saw themselves not as victims of the world order, but as pioneers rewriting it. What began in Burkina Faso as a spark of defiance had now become a continental blaze. News outlets that once ignored Africa were suddenly running headlines about the new Silicon Savannah and the continent of innovation. Investors who had dismissed Africa as too risky were now scrambling to get a seat at the table. But not everyone came with good intentions. While some global partners genuinely wanted to collaborate, others saw this rise as a threat to their dominance. Secret meetings were held in foreign capitals. Intelligence reports warn, if Africa continues on this path, it will control the next wave of technology. In Washington and Paris, policymakers whispered about sanctions and trade barriers. In Beijing and Moscow, opportunities were quietly explored to tie Africa's future closer to their own interests. Suddenly, the world wasn't just watching Africa, it was competing for it. And in the middle of this storm stood Ibrahim Traoré. Calm, unshaken, he declared, we are not a playground for superpowers. We are not a market to be exploited. We are a people who have chosen dignity over dependence. His words electrified the continent. To many Africans, it was the first time they felt their leaders were negotiating with the world from a place of strength, not weakness. The tables were turning, and the balance of power was shifting. For decades, the image of Africa had been reduced to poverty, hunger, and conflict. pictures carefully chosen by foreign media to define an entire continent. But now, the narrative was changing before the world's eyes. Instead of dusty villages, the world saw bustling innovation hubs. Instead of helplessness, they saw defiance. Instead of endless need, they saw undeniable creativity. A new Africa was being broadcast, one where young coders from Lagos were building apps that outperformed Silicon Valley rivals, where solar-powered drones from Nairobi were delivering medicine to rural clinics faster than any government system, and where a fintech startup in Burkina Faso was processing payments for millions of people who had never touched a traditional bank. The hashtag #MadeInAfrica trended globally. For the first time, Africans weren't begging to be included in the global story. They were writing their own, and the world was forced to listen. As one journalist put it, Africa has stopped asking for aid. It has started offering solutions. And at the heart of this transformation was a young soldier turned president, Ibrahim Traoré, whose vision had unleashed not just a wave of innovation, but a new identity for an entire continent. From Latin America to Southeast Asia, leaders of small nations began pointing to Africa as proof that sovereignty and progress were not mutually exclusive. University students in Asia carried posters of Ibrahim Traoré, calling him the voice of the global South. Activists in South America declared, "If Africa can break free, so can we." Even within Africa, something remarkable was happening. Countries long divided by borders and rivalries began finding common ground in this shared vision of independence. Presidents who once bowed to foreign powers started speaking with a new tone, firmer, prouder, unshaken. It wasn't just politics. It was cultural. African music, fashion, and technology surged into the global mainstream with a fresh confidence. No longer framed as exotic imports, they became global trends. Young Africans, once desperate to flee to Europe or America, were now choosing to stay, believing they had a future at home worth fighting for. The story of Burkina Faso, a nation once dismissed as one of the poorest, had now become the story of a world shifting. And behind it all was Ibrahim Traoré's message, echoing across continents. We are not weak. We are not broken. We are the future. But not everyone was celebrating this new dawn. In the corridors of Washington, Paris, and London, alarm bells rang louder than ever. Reports described Africa's surge as a threat to the balance of global influence. Western companies, who once held monopolies on African markets, now faced competitors they could neither buy nor silence. Behind closed doors, strategies were drawn. Economic sanctions, covert pressure, funding of opposition groups, and the oldest weapon of all, propaganda. Foreign media began to recycle old stereotypes, painting African leaders as radicals, dictators, or unstable. Ibrahim Traoré, in particular, became their favorite target. Headlines screamed that he was too young, too dangerous, too military-minded. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, none of that mattered. The people knew the difference between lies and lived reality. While Western commentators spoke of chaos, Africans pointed to new schools, functioning hospitals, and thriving tech hubs. While elites in Europe and America scoffed at Africa's ambitions, ordinary citizens around the world began questioning, why are they afraid of Africa rising? The more the pressure came from outside, the more united Africa became within. It was as if every attack only added fuel to the fire. And Traoré, instead of backing down, stood taller, his speeches carrying the calm defiance of a man who knew he was standing on the right side of history. And so, we return to the question that echoes louder with every passing day. Why is Africa's success feared more than its struggles? For decades, the world accepted images of famine, war, and poverty. But when Africa begins to rise, when its children write code instead of begging for aid, when its leaders speak of dignity instead of dependence, that is when the world grows nervous. Why? Because a free Africa changes everything. Ibrahim Traore's vision is not just about Burkina Faso. It is about sovereignty. It is about dignity. It is about survival. He reminds us that no nation, no matter how small, is doomed to be a servant forever. That with courage, unity, and belief, even the most forgotten corner of the world can become a beacon of hope. So the real question is not, can Africa rise? The real question is, what happens when it does? Because the silent rise of African tech, the new spirit of independence, and the unstoppable will of its people are no longer whispers. They are a roar. And that roar is telling the world, Africa's time has come.